LP Washington, hello. Thank you for having me. Came from Miami. It was brutal, but the weather makes up for it out here. It's very high quality. So yeah, a little bit about my backstory. I am a second-gen Libertarian, a rare second-gen autist. It's unusual that we reproduce, but I was fortunate. And well, all right, let's make it sexy. So I came out of college in 2008, and I entered right into the teeth of the Great Recession. And I had no interest in working for my family business, but didn't have much choice because my dad was dealing with a ton of foreclosures, and he knew that he couldn't trust on anybody or in anybody. So I went in there, and my job was to liquidate over 100 foreclosed properties. And because of my Austrian economics background and my libertarian background, I was very disturbed to see the real human damage that was done because of central banking run amok and interest rate manipulation. And basically, at that point, I kind of decided at some point in my life, I wanted to either get into politics or become a college professor or something to make a difference, because I realized that, there's real human suffering and people don't understand what's happening to them. And it's heartbreaking. And I feel like the only people that really get it are libertarians. And that's also heartbreaking, because then you have an entire generation of people that are raised thinking that this system is corrupt and it's capitalism's fault, when in truth, it's central banking and the state. Story is always time.
Can you grab one of these mics?
Is this too quiet?
No, that one's feeding back somehow.
You want to try this one?
No, that one is too. It's that set. So the thing is on the bottom. You just click on the button on the bottom, not the button. Thank you.
Check. Whoa. Much stronger. All right. So what happened was that you had a Fed funds rate around 4% in the 2005-2006 arena. And at the time, right after the Great Reset, or the Great Financial Recession, you had a national debt of about $12 trillion. Today it's $31 trillion. So that means in 15 years, we have increased our national debt by about 150%. That's not sustainable. You don't have to be a real math wizard to figure that out. And obviously the solutions that were presented to us at the time was that they were going to have Dodd-Frank and prevent banking from being too big to fail. And what has that created moving forward? We now have essentially 4 banking institutions that are bigger than any banking institutions probably in the history of the world. So as is usually the case, the solution that was presented to the people during the time, it sounds as if it's going to be beneficial to the little guy. It ends up benefiting the most wealthy and powerful and the politically connected. And needless to say, more and more people start to think that capitalism is unsustainable. And if you don't understand what we understand, that's a pretty logical conclusion to make, because you think that JP Morgan Chase is a capitalist institution, when in reality it's the biggest crony corporate enterprise that's ever existed. Sorry, my notes. I'm trying to condense because we're cutting back on time, so I'm going to just cut some things out. But so then 2020 rolls around, and I finally get my chance. I finally realize that there's I've now, because of passive income and brokering a couple $100 million in private money mortgage loans, I was able to retire in the teeth of the recession. Also realizing that I couldn't possibly know what the future held in terms of the economy. As a fiduciary to my investors, I couldn't, in good conscience, continue to deploy their capital. And we'll get into fiduciary duty a little bit later on, but it's an important topic. So you have the lockdowns, and then, once again, in order to save us from ourselves, the printing presses fire up. You have $5 or $6 trillion that are spent or printed essentially in 2020, continues into 2021. And then you have an inflationary period that causes everyone's buttholes to pucker. And I don't blame people. But this is where it gets really interesting. So because of that, you have a cryptocurrency bubble that starts to appear. And the reason is logical. A lot of people that do understand what we do start to exit the old banking system and try and seek inflation hedges. And fortunately, there's a really good one out there. In my opinion, it's Bitcoin. You may have differences of opinion, but I won't get into arguments with you guys about it. And Silicon Valley Bank is kind of what sets off this crisis, and this is what I wanted to talk to you guys about tonight. So in 2021, Silicon Valley Bank has over $80 billion in liquid cash that's deposited from their depositors, which are a lot of businesses, many of which are doing really well because of the cryptocurrency bubble that's happening at the time. And because of the Dodd-Frank laws, they are now incentivized to put that $80 billion into mortgage-backed securities or T-bills because the regulators have classified this as the same thing as liquid capital or cash. Needless to say, a long-term debt instrument is not the same thing as cash. If you have a huge movement in interest rates, I'm sorry, this is very wonky, and I apologize if this is boring, but it'll get interesting later on. If you put $80 billion into a long-term debt instrument and simultaneously the Federal Reserve reverses course and takes the Fed funds rate from 1/4 point up to 4 3/4 point, well, every long-term debt instrument is now underwater because you have to liquidate it in order to get your capital back. And if you want to do that, you're going to have to take a loss, a write-down. Once again, the Fed, FDIC, Treasury step in and they say, we're going to create a new lending vehicle that allows these banking institutions to offload these toxic assets. TARP, anyone? You guys remember TARP from back in 2008? Well, same concept, but this time what they're doing it with is either mortgage-backed securities or T-bills. Both of these are supposed to be some of the most secure investment instruments that you can find out there, especially government T-bills. And what we're finding now is that because of the debt carry that the national government has, there's really no safe place to invest. And this becomes extremely problematic because what it creates is malinvestment. And any Austrian will tell you that's a problem. That's where you start to get the bubbles. And we're now dealing with, in my estimation, probably the biggest bubble in the history of mankind. And this is really dire. I'm sorry. But I'm just being honest with you guys because I feel like you can handle it. So what's interesting about this is that Janet Yellen last week on Capitol Hill, she is asked about the bailout mechanism. And the reason that she's asked about it is because the writing of the bailout mechanism says that the head of the FDIC, the head of the Fed, and the head of the Treasury are the ultimate say-so on what banking institution is systemically important and who will get bailed out and who will not. So for whatever reason, Silicon Valley Bank barely meets that threshold. But what they're signaling to the market is that any institution smaller than that will not meet the bailout threshold. And that means that depositors in any small or medium-sized bank that is slightly smaller than Silicon Valley Bank, which, by the way, was not a huge bank, it was like the 20th biggest in the country. Well, they're now all, if you have your deposits in any of those banks, you are at jeopardy. That means that your deposit, if they go insolvent because of these debt instruments that are underwater, well, then you may not get your deposits back. So that means that your life savings can go poof. This is anything north of $250,000. Obviously, FDIC insures anything below that for now. But this is what I'm talking about when it comes to bad incentives. So the incentive here is going to be for any small depositor, any small business in particular, to divest themselves of the small and medium-sized banking institutions and migrate their deposits to the big boys, the JP Morgan Chase, the Bank of America. Well, that's not a great pathway, is it? Because it means that we have less and less competition, and it means that you get less and less quality treatment. And if you've been into a JP Morgan Chase or a Bank of America over the past couple of years, the treatment that you receive as a customer is already degrading because they're essentially functioning in an oligopoly and a state-granted one. So the trajectory of things are very dire, and I feel as if, I got into a lot of trouble because I was trying to inform my audience as to if they didn't bail out Silicon Valley Bank, what would happen? But really what I was just trying to tell people is that there is no good path from here. There is no pain-free pathway. You're drowning in so much debt on a national level. You have 31 trillion. You have over 100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Then on the global level, you have hundreds of trillion. Then you have derivatives contracts that are leveraging up based off of these debt instruments that couldn't possibly be paid back either. I mean, we're talking about essentially incalculable, like human beings can't even comprehend these numbers. They're so big, quadrillions of dollars worth of debt. You just simply can't pay them back. So my fear and my concern, and the reason I want to talk to you guys about it tonight, is because I think that ultimately what we're going to see, and this is where the Great Reset concept comes in and the central bank digital currency concept comes in, is that they also understand this. Yes, they're Keynesians. Yes, they're modern monetary theorists. Yes, they're idiots. Yes, they're scumbags. But they are smart enough to know that this is not a sustainable path. And they're going to have to find a way to migrate from this unsustainable debt system into something new. But knowing that they're sinister, they're going to try and improve upon it. And unfortunately, what we see is that many of the people, the Western leadership class, is modeling and looking at China and the CCP model with, as opposed to being appalled by it, kind of envy. And that's disturbing, needless to say. And I think that all you have to do is look at the lockdown process and the fact that the CCP was the first country to lock down, along with Italy, and then it kind of cascaded across the West to see that this is, we no longer have a dichotomous split where you have like the free world. It's just not real anymore. And for me, that was really jarring because I still believed at the time that there were so many people in America that would never accept, never acquiesce to the concept of a lockdown. I mean, that's why I named my show what I did. I was so blown away that this was something that we would do, especially for an airborne pathogen, particularly one that's highly survivable. It's just lunacy. But once you see that, once the veil falls, it's kind of hard to go back, right? Like you realize what you're up against at that point. And I think that it's going to be, So now the trend is, because you're seeing this persistent appeal to bailing out institutions, now at the lower level, you have the average people, the normies, if you will, or the poors, not really, because they're college graduates, but they're now turning with their hands out and saying, where's mine? Where's my bailout? And, well, as a libertarian, I can still look at them and be like, just work, man. Just pay off your loans. At the end of the day, I do kind of understand the human instinct to go like, well, you guys bailed out the biggest, most wealthy institutions in the world. Why would you not also bail out my student loans? And this is kind of the morality crisis that you get into, because you have this pattern that people start to see, and they improperly but understandably conclude, well, there is no limit to the amount of money we can print. There is no limit to the amount of debt that we can have. But the truth is not that simple. Unfortunately, it's very complex. And this is where it gets even darker. So, sorry, this is like going very deep in the weeds, but you have, over the past 2 weeks, you have now seen China attempt to negotiate peace in both Ukraine as well as Yemen. And these are good things as far as I'm concerned, but there's an underlying factor that's very important to understand. The war in Yemen was largely a kind of a proxy between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So China has reached out to both Saudi Arabia and Iran to try and broker a peace, which is fantastic because Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, and they've been getting just destroyed with sanctions and bombs for a decade, and it's heartbreaking. But the reason that this is so important is that after we came off the gold standard in the 70s, the way that it was negotiated was that Nixon went to the Saudis and said, if you guys continue to sell your oil exclusively in the US dollar, that will give a backing, an underpinning to the US dollar in terms of global trade, which will give value to the dollar that would otherwise be valueless because the entire world will need to use it. And that's what they did. So this is a paradigm shift, one that's so cataclysmic, no one's really wrapped their head around it yet. But because China has brokered this peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia that is in direct conflict with the Western desires and Israel's desires, but I won't go there. I don't want to get canceled again. I already look like a Nazi. It's terrible. So, because they have brokered this peace, which, as I've said, I think is a good thing. But what it signals is that the Saudi Arabians are preparing to migrate away from the petrodollar system. They have already signaled as much by saying it overtly that they intend to sell their oil in the yuan, which is the Chinese currency. Well, the Russians have also kind of hit their limit in terms of Western hegemony, and they've decided that they're also open to brokering peace deals between Ukraine and themselves, but with China as the peacemaker, whereas Blinken and the West, the US, is completely adamantly opposed to any peace deal in Ukraine, which is lunacy, but I'll set that aside because I can't do anything about that. The finance issue is more important for us as long as we avoid World War III, God willing. So you have the potential, and the reason that this is so important to understand is that because our dollar's value is maintained primarily because of global trade. Because when we print it, if it were to all just circulate in America, it would be extraordinarily hyperinflationary. And this is what a lot of Austrians, including Peter Schiff, get wrong. The reason that he has been predicting inflation for so many decades and getting it wrong year after year is because he never gave enough credence. This is my analysis. He'd probably disagree and want to fight me, but it's true. Is that he does not take enough consideration to the amount of the printing and the dollars that are then used in global trade. They're essentially exported. So it prevents that dollar from circulating here, which keeps the inflation at a reasonable, manageable level. That can be changing very dramatically and very soon if the petrodollar system is coming to an end. So where's the good news, Clint? There's got to be some good news in there. There is. I think that Bitcoin and precious metals are going to be an incredible hedge in the next 5 to 10 years. And very fortunately, I feel that most libertarians are privy to it, if not already, hedging in that direction. So I just want to encourage you guys to explain what I just did. Do it in a way that doesn't make people suicidal, but explain it to people in a way that allows them to understand that there are forces at play that are making their lives much harder. They're all from the state, as is usually the case, and central banks, which is basically the state. And there is a pathway to human autonomy and independence and profit and capacity to care for yourself and your family and your loved ones that can be separated from these evil institutions. And you can do it now as opposed to waiting for the collapse. So I think that there's really a lot of reason to be hopeful because so many of the most brilliant minds, and this has been probably the biggest white pill that I've had from doing my show over the past 3 years, is that I've got to interact with such brilliant people that are on the cutting edge of these technologies and are trying to create and innovate as opposed to just sitting there and complaining, which is what I do so well. They actually are out there creating tools to find wealth and find independence before the inevitable death of the dollar and the global fiat system. So I think that that's something to be very hopeful about. And then I think that there's also a really interesting trend that's happening amongst the younger generation, which gives me a lot of hope. And that's the trad life and the homesteading. You know, you have so many people online. I think that the cancel culture is kind of hitting its apex, and we're hopefully seeing a denouement where you'll start to see more and more people that are sick of biting their tongue, and they're also sick of the corporate world and ESG. I haven't even gone into that. Would you guys like to hear about that? I don't even know if I have enough time. 7:50. It's kind of depressing. All right, I'll just hold off on ESG. You guys can listen to my show for that. But I think that those trends are really positive because you're seeing, even though people aren't necessarily diagnosing it with the amount of in-depth analysis that I just broke your brains with tonight, they are doing it from an instinctual level. They're understanding that there is something sick about what's happening in our culture, in our economy, in our government. And they're realizing, without realizing it, that they're going to have to take more control and more personal responsibility moving forward. And I think at the end of the day, that's ultimately the cure for basically everything that we face, is an embrace of personal responsibility. We have outsourced so much of it for so long. And I think that the leaders of the next generation will be those that embrace personal responsibility as opposed to running from it. And those that actually tell people to embrace it as opposed to telling them that they're a victim of something. I think Jordan Peterson's rise to fame over the past decade has been a good example of that. Clean your room, very simple fatherly advice, but it was so profound it went viral. I mean, how sick are we that that's profound? But that's where we were. So I think that that's a very optimistic note that they're essentially what I'm saying is I believe that libertarianism is essentially the counterculture right now and one that isn't unpopular. And that's a trend and that's something new that I haven't seen in my life. And I think that that is reason for tremendous hope and optimism and getting fired up and energized. And I think that there's one other note I'd like to give you guys is that try and give this message in a way that isn't "I told you so," because I have a huge problem with that myself. So this is why I'm saying it. It is rough when you warn people year after year of like, hey, this is all bad. We should not do that, and then they do it, and then you're like, it's bad, and I told you. Okay, yeah, but it's not really helpful when people are in a financial crisis. Like if they have their deposits at Silicon Valley Bank and you're like, well, I told you, like that doesn't help them. They're looking at losing their business and their life savings. So it's really important that you use this moment where people are seeking answers, where people are more discontented with the media and the government and everything, essentially, to say, yes, I did tell you, but setting that aside, let me tell you what comes next. Because I think that's really what made Ron Paul so special is that he told you in advance, and then afterwards, he didn't have any glee about it. He was just like, I can tell you how to fix it from here too. And just this persistent kindness, this belief that like, yes, I do have the answers, and yes, it is pretty obvious to a libertarian, but it's not to the average person. And have some sympathy and compassion for what they're going through in their lives. And I think that that's what I've struggled with a lot until recently, and I'm trying to imbue in you guys a willingness to maintain love and openness towards people that are otherwise not listening to us for decades. And I know that's very challenging. I guess this is my Buddhist background that makes me feel like this, but I think it's really helpful. And I think that that's ultimately what's going to bring us together and hopefully get us to the other side without any sort of violence, which is another concern I have. But I'm not going to go there because that's too sad. Anyways, I think that more than anything, what I see in front of me is more opportunity than I've ever seen in my life for our message and our worldview to catch fire, to catch on, to have people that actually are willing to listen and willing to try out what we're discussing. I mean, Bitcoin has converted more people to our worldview maybe than Ron Paul, which is crazy to think about because it's just this like technological innovation. But if you talk to any Bitcoiner, whether they know Ron Paul or not, they sound exactly like us because they all get it. After just a couple of years of being an investor in that environment, you start to understand why does this investment make sense? And I think that there are so many different layers of opportunities that we're going to be facing moving forward that it would just be tragic if we fail in this moment. And I think that our opportunity is really now. And it's dire. So, yeah, capitalize on it. Anyways, I wanted to just thank you guys so much for having me out here. Every time I get to go talk about what I'm most passionate about in life, I just feel incredibly blessed. The Ron Pauls and the Murray Rothbards that lit the torch of liberty that I got to witness in awe of, I feel as if I get to carry it forward to a certain extent, and I know that you guys are carrying it along with me. So thank you so much, and let's do it. Let's win, huh?
Let's do it.
Sorry, I just said.
Doing questions? Yeah. Got a couple questions.
Questions? What therapist would you like to?
Where'd you get
SSRIs?
Where do we get your shirt?
Oh, that's toplobster.com. The homie. Yeah, it's evil socialist garbage. ESG. No questions? Okay. You guys want to give her the mic?
Hi, thank you. My name is Amber King. I'm with War Media. I just did a 2-hour show last night, actually talking about that exact topic. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Also wanted to find out, like, we are living in probably the birthplace of the smart city, being Seattle proper, and I see the coming technocracy happening at such a rapid pace. What advice do you have to avoid this yet survive outside of it?
Well, I mean, that's probably one of my biggest concerns, actually, is that if we haven't learned that the technocrats don't have the right answers after Anthony Fauci's reign of terror, I don't know how to reach people on that one. But the good news is that I think a hell of a lot of people did wake up during that period and realize that these appeals to authority of these incredibly fallible, corrupt lunatics didn't work out so hot. So maybe we shouldn't do that moving forward. And I think that that's how you break people from that mindset, is to demonstrate, like, hey, those 3, 4, 5 jabs that you got, and you still got COVID, and now your heart's inflamed. Like, maybe don't do that anymore. I honestly, I think that's the only way you can reach people is to just, like, the last 3 years of our lives have been hell. They've basically ruined the world and the economy because they did exactly what you're describing. So if that reaches them, then great. And if it doesn't, maybe it's time to cut loose. I don't know.
Any other questions?
How close do you think we are to a CBDC?
Close.
Where's the loading bar?
Yeah, I mean, there's already white papers from, like, Chicago Fed and a bunch of global white papers, as well as many trial CBDCs in foreign countries that are already out there. So it's not far off. It's definitely not far off. And I think that most likely what we're going to see is, well, I'll give you some good news here, is that, DeSantis, despite all his pitfalls, he's been on the front lines of pushing back. In fact, over the past week, they put together a 20-state coalition that was supposed to essentially ban both ESG and hopefully CBDCs, which is huge. The fact that these concepts aren't so wonky that politicians aren't just ignoring them entirely is huge progress. And, I credit libertarians with that as much as anybody, that this is actually something that's being discussed broadly. It's huge. So that's good news. As far as, like, timeline goes, I mean, some of them are already in testing phases. So, and you have the FedNow program that's supposed to launch in July. I think that's kind of a backdoor to central bank digital currencies, where everyone would have a depository account directly with the Federal Reserve. And that's a red line of red lines. Like, do not accept that. So it's imminent, but it's also avoidable and divestible. Like, you can just opt out of the system and kind of create these two dual rail economy. So I don't know. It's coming, and it's coming soon, but it's also not like an inevitability, if that makes any sense.
I had a question for you. If anybody, okay.
Go ahead.
So, I guess I'm a little bit confused, like, why a bank run is so inevitable when like, you don't actually have to go to the bank and get the money out. They're just gonna, you can just spend it digitally, and it seems to mitigate a lot of the bank run effect. So I guess I was just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
I'm sorry, I'm missing the question there.
I guess I'm just not understanding, like, why these banks are at risk of being
being
like
insolvent?
being the smaller banks of being insolvent.
Yeah.
They're
I can explain that for sure.
okay.
Well, first off, it's fractional reserve banking. So these banks lend out more assets than they have anyways. They usually sit on 5 to 10% of the actual capital that they are responsible in terms of depositor accounts. So if you ever have a time where all of the deposits go to any bank and they ask for all of their money back, every bank is insolvent. I mean, that's just how the system is set up. But this is why you have FDIC insurance to prevent people from getting spooked and doing that. Is that part of your question, or is there more to it?
I guess I might just being special here.
It's okay.
Like
it's complicated.
because
But
if they're not actually getting their physical dollars, I guess I just don't. Maybe because even the digital things are tied up elsewhere.
yeah, I mean, the digital accounting is the exact same as the paper accounting. I mean, most of the dollars that we utilize today are done electronically, and you never hold them anyways. I mean, all of your credit card transactions and things like that. So
it's all made up, but it's not all
yeah,
made up.
exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, theoretically, you're supposed to be able to convert that into paper dollars. So, most people don't, but that's the idea, at least. Someone over there.
Actually, we just have one more question here.
Yeah, we can't cut him off. He was halfway through.
I was going to ask if the economy gets particularly bad, will you be personally investing in a prostitute for your friend Toad?
I've been trying to buy him a prostitute for a long time. I don't know. Okay, it keeps turning me down.
All right.
Yeah, that was Tower Game humor.
Last question.
Okay, I'm gonna make it count. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I have two questions actually. The first question is, can you maybe just say at least maybe the top 3 biggest concerns with central banking digital currency?
Sure.
And just kind of give a very rough overview of why that's a problem.
Okay, yeah.
And then my second problem is, do you have any fun stories from touring with Limp Bizkit?
Jack Pasovic, how dare you?
You don't have to say.
I couldn't answer it because I didn't do that. All right, yeah. I mean, the central bank digital currency is really just pure panopticon totalitarianism. So I'll be specific now. One, it has the capacity to be what's called redeemed from the creator, which in this instance would be either the CCP or the U.S. Treasury, where if you say you are able to implement a social credit score and you have your deposits in the central bank digital currency account, they can just vanish. They can literally just make them disappear, and you'd have no capacity to ever prove they even existed because the entire data set is held with the Federal Reserve or the Treasury. So it's insane. It's insane that anyone would ever accept that. So that's one aspect of it. The capacity to track transactions is essentially perfected. So you can't do any sort of off-books things, any agorist in here. That's a non-starter. And then it also allows them to manipulate the economy in a much more efficient fashion, but that is not a good thing because they can implement UBI, they can essentially increase taxes and withdraw your funds without your permission. I mean, it's limitless. The amount of problems that come from central bank digital currencies are it's crazy. It's crazy that anyone would even talk about it, much less talk about it positively. So I know I don't need to sell you guys in this room as to why it's a problem, but there's 3 reasons for you. Thank you guys so much.